This is the second of 4 talks on the Individual Psychology Clinical Formulation for Adler Graduate School course number 511. The focus of this talk is on the role of the life tasks in understanding the person. I use the life tasks in 2 different ways in a case formulation. On the one hand, when I am exploring the onset of the complaint and the exogenous situation, I am considering the possibility that the person was confronted with what they saw as an overwhelming life task, a life task for which they were poorly prepared. On the other hand, I also use the life tasks when I am considering the person's current functioning. Adler defined 3 life tasks, what he called, quote, the inseparable bond that of necessity links men together for association, for the provision of livelihood, and for the caring of offspring, end quote. He noted that none of these tasks can be solved separately, recognizing that each of them demands a successful approach to the other 2. He described these tasks as an inescapable consequence of being human and being embedded in a social network. In a series of papers, 3 of Adler's colleagues and students presented 2 additional tasks. Regarding the self-task, Mozak notes, quote, people need to come to a conclusion about themselves, and that process and its outcome can greatly influence functioning in all of the other tasks. End quote. Finally, this group of writers identified 5 subtasks for the spiritual task, namely relationship to God, religion, relationship to the universe, metaphysical issues, and the meaning of life. There is some disagreement in the individual psychology community about whether these last 2 tasks are of the same order as the initial 3 tasks. Adler believed that events associated with the onset of problems and distress, and the client's interpretation of these circumstances, were one of the 5 trustworthy tools to understand a person. In the previous talk in this series, I discussed the combination of a psychosocial stressor along with the lack of preparation of the person interacting in order to precipitate symptoms and distress. In his later writings, Adler discussed the role of the life tasks in the precipitating process, saying, quote, the proximity of a task that demands cooperation and fellowship is always the exciting factor of the symptoms, end quote. In individual psychology, courage is the willingness to meet the tasks of life in a cooperative manner, that is, in a manner that is high in social interest. This is what Adler said on page 32 of Volume 9 of the Collected Clinical Works. Quote, an individual who has been well prepared for social life in childhood will not have great difficulties in his sexual life. Courage, an optimistic attitude, common sense, and the feeling of being at home on the earth will enable him to face advantages and disadvantages with equal firmness. His goal of superiority will be identified with ideals of serving humanity and of overcoming its difficulties with his creative power. End quote. One sign of a neurosis or an effort to avoid a life task is a hesitating attitude. For Adler, hesitation is a sign of a person's diminished courage to do what the situation requires. For example, on pages 6 to 12 of Volume 9 of the Collected Clinical Works, he presents the case of a 27-year-old woman, a second child whose older sister was more beautiful, more clever, and more popular. When the sister married, the client began a relationship with a married man. Adler notes, quote, her selection of such a troublesome love is obviously grounds for suspicion that she does not wish to see love and marriage through, end quote. This hesitating attitude toward love and marriage protects the client from meeting the task of intimacy head-on and is hypothesized as the dynamic underlying her multiple compulsions. Adler goes on to explore how the compulsions overcome felt inferiorities and achieve personal superiority. He describes the logic of this dynamic by noting, quote, "As long as she avoids love and marriage, she is not measured against her sister's happy marriage. Whatever happens, she can say, 'But I am fully occupied with my compulsive ideas.'" End quote. This adds a new dimension to our thinking about the onset of problems. Not only do we need to consider events surrounding the onset of distress and the client's interpretation of them, we also need to consider the presence of a life task that feels overwhelming or threatening to the client. I also use the life tasks as a structure for my inquiry into current functioning. I ask about functioning in intimate relationships, in social and community settings, and in the work and vocational domain. I always inquire about spirituality, religious affiliations and practices, and the meaning of life for the client. This inquiry is often a chance for me to educate the client about my interest in them as a whole person and not just as a set of problems or symptoms. I have found this inquiry to be especially fruitful in adding items to the problem list. By asking clients if they want to add this concern to the problem list, I am communicating to them that the focus of our treatment is co-determined and that they have a voice in what we're going to focus on in therapy. In their 2012 book, Bob Powers and Jane Griffith make extensive use of the life tasks in their initial interview inquiry. And in 1993, Claire Hawes and her associates developed the life tasks into an assessment strategy and therapeutic technique for couples using a semi-structured interview.